Two of the biggest financial disasters in modern history happened almost 80 years apart from each other. The Great Depression of the 1930s and the 2008 financial crisis. Completely different eras, different technology, different financial systems. But when economists study them closely, something surprisingly shows up. It appears out of nowhere. The same triggers show up again and again. Debt bubbles, overconfidence in rising asset prices, banks taking on hidden risk. The only real difference is the tools governments use to respond. So today, let's break down the Great Depression to 2008, the same triggers that caused both crisis and the new financial tools that are used to stop them. Here we go. To understand the connection between these two crises, we need to start with a simple but powerful idea. Financial crises rarely appear out of nowhere. Most of the time, they build slowly during periods of economic optimism. When the economy is growing, markets are rising, and credit is easy to obtain, people become more comfortable taking risks. Borrowing increases. Asset prices rise, and the financial system becomes more leveraged. This pattern was clearly visible in the 1920s before the Great Depression. The decade was often called the Roaring Twenties. Stock markets surged, industrial production expanded, and millions of Americans began investing in stocks for the first time. But many of those investments were made with borrowed money. Investors could purchase stocks on margin, meaning they only had to put down a small portion of the total price. The rest was borrowed from brokers. As long as stock prices kept rising, this system worked, but leverage always carries a hidden danger. If prices fall, losses become magnified, and that's exactly what happened during the stock market crash of 1929. When prices started falling, investors who had borrowed money were forced to sell their stocks to cover their loans. Those forced sales pushed prices down even further, which triggered even more selling. The market collapse quickly spread through the financial system. Banks that had invested heavily in the market began failing. Businesses lost access to credit. Unemployment surged, and the United States entered the worst economic downturn in modern history. The Great Depression lasted throughout much of the 1930s. Millions of people lost jobs. Thousands of banks collapsed, and global trade shrank dramatically. One of the key lessons economists learned from the Great Depression was the danger of financial systems becoming too fragile. Because once confidence disappears, the system can unravel very quickly. Now fast forward several decades to the early 2000s. At first glance, the economy looked very different. Technology had transformed finance. Banks had developed complex financial instruments. Global capital markets were deeply interconnected. But beneath the surface, a familiar pattern was building again. This time the bubble wasn't in the stock market, it was in housing. Home prices were rising rapidly across the United States. Mortgage lending expanded dramatically, and banks began packaging mortgages into complex financial products known as mortgage-backed securities. These securities were sold to investors around the world. The idea was that spreading mortgages across many investors would reduce risk. But in reality, it often made the system harder to understand because the underlying loans were sometimes far riskier than investors realized. Many mortgages were issued to borrowers with limited income verification or very low initial payments. As long as housing prices kept rising, the system appeared stable. But just like the leverage in the 1920s stock market, the housing boom was built on fragile assumptions. Hey, real quick, I want to take a quick break and throw this idea out. If you would like to take advantage of the coming crisis in real estate, I put together a package of 4 courses. The Real Estate Crash Course that shows you the cycles of real estate, what to do during a bear market, how to sell the properties, and so much more. The link's down below if you want to take advantage of buying all 4 courses for a crazy price. Now, back to the video. When housing prices began falling in 2007, the entire structure started to crack. Mortgage defaults increased. The value of mortgage-backed securities collapsed, and banks that had invested heavily in these assets suddenly faced enormous losses. By 2008, several major financial institutions were in serious trouble. One of the most dramatic moments came when the investment bank Lehman Brothers collapsed, triggering panic throughout global markets. Credit markets froze, stock markets plunged, and governments around the world rushed to stabilize the financial system. But here's where the response to 2008 differed dramatically from the 1930s. During the Great Depression, policymakers initially allowed many banks to fail and kept monetary policy relatively tight. Economists later concluded that these decisions deepened the downturn. By contrast, during the 2008 crisis, governments acted far more aggressively. Central banks slashed interest rates to near zero. Governments injected capital into major banks. And the Federal Reserve introduced new policies like quantitative easing, which involved purchasing large amounts of financial assets to inject liquidity into the system. These tools were designed to restore confidence and prevent a complete financial collapse. While the recession that followed was severe, many economists believe these interventions helped prevent another depression-level disaster. But when you step back and compare the two crises, a striking similarity appears. Both began with asset bubbles fueled by leverage. Both involved financial institutions taking on risks that were not fully understood, and both triggered rapid loss of confidence once asset prices started falling. The biggest difference was the speed and scale of the policy response. The Great Depression reshaped economic thinking about banking regulation and financial oversight, and the 2008 crisis reshaped how central banks respond to financial emergencies. But the underlying lesson remains remarkably consistent. Financial systems become dangerous when optimism, leverage, and complexity combine, because during boom periods, risks often appear small. But once asset prices reverse, those risks can spread quickly through the entire economy. That's why economists constantly study past crises, not because history repeats exactly, but because the patterns often rhyme. Understanding those patterns can help investors, policymakers, and everyday people recognize the warning signs earlier. And in finance, recognizing those signals early can make a huge difference. If you found this breakdown helpful and want more videos explaining the history behind major financial crises and economic cycles, consider subscribing. And if you want to continue learning about the patterns that appear before financial collapses, check out the next video on your screen where we break down the early warning signals that often show up before major market crashes. Understanding those signals can help you see financial shifts long before they dominate the headlines. I'll see you in the next one.